decoration, lighting, furniture a lot of times too. One of the biggest purposes of Restore really is to reduce our carbon footprint.
But and in Palm Beach Gardens, there was no overt intimidation. A lot of frightening things, but no overt intimidation.
One of the intentions or kavanot or meditations that I think those of us who are white can carry with us when we stand online for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours, or we're afraid of being intimidated at a poll. This is what Black Americans have dealt with since 1865. So let us keep perspective of the fear we feel or the annoyance we have or the sense of privilege being eroded because we have to wait in line to vote. May it teach us something. May it be a way of our learning something deeper, that those of us who are white and assumed the privilege that we could walk in without waiting and without fear and cast a vote that we would assume be counted. Maybe this is about teaching us a lesson that Black Americans have known for generations, which is their votes were not necessarily going to happen and their votes weren't necessarily going to get counted. And I think we have to see it as a teaching that we can expand our understanding of what's going on in this country and become even more deeply aware of where privilege exists and what we have to do to expand our consciousness so that inconvenience and fear and a sense that no matter what we do, our vote isn't, and we get to vote, we're not even sure our vote's going to get counted. If we want to understand this country, we have to understand this is not a new phenomenon. It might be new for me, Sharon Kleinbaum, who grew up middle class in New Jersey and lives in New York City, that this is the first time in my life that I waited an hour and a half to vote. That I need to say, oh my God, in what planet have I been living? And now we have to understand what others have understood for a long time. Believe me, Tasha Calhoun and I talk about this all the time, and she rolls her eyes listening to white people talking about this election. She is from Georgia. When we went to the lynching museum memorial with her, she found a Calhoun County, which is named for the plantation owner who owned her family and all of the Calhouns who were lynched. So we have an opportunity to expand our consciousness, to go beyond ourselves in a way that those of us who are progressive could only have, had words before this election, I think. We've only had words. Now I think we understand stuff in a really deeper way. And I think that's part of the explosion of light into the universe, is when people begin to understand things in their heart and their soul that was only an intellectual concept. So I see this as a great progression in world consciousness and a great explosion of the light. And now let's study some
Kleinbaum. We're going to stop there. So Jeffrey, Sherry, Dean, we love you. Put any thoughts, feelings, questions into the chat. But we're going to go from there into song, which I think is really the only appropriate step by step.
Yes, and Cantor Nimi sends his regrets. He's not going to be with us this morning. However, I found a terrific version of Psalm 29. And one of the performers is my friend, the cantor Rosenberg, who is at Temple Emmanuel, a conservative synagogue in Newton, who is from Argentina. And this is very, very much Sephardic, South American inflected. I'm not sure I'm going to play the whole, I'm going to play half for intro and half for outro because it's a little long. But Great. Here we go.
Which psalm is this?
29. Adonai.
אדוני אלפיים רבים כל אדוני בגבורה כל אדוני בהדר כל אדוני שובר הרזים וישבר אדוני את ארזי הלבנון וירגידם כמו עגל לבנון וסיריון כמו בן רהיטים כל אדוני רוצה לעמוד לעמוד כל אדוני יכיל מדבר יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש כל אדוני יכוון עיינות ויחשוף יערות ובכן קרוב ויאמר אומר קרבות לי 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 לי
All right, so we'll play a little bit more to play us out, but I wanted to share that.
That was fabulous. I
Isn't that
really
great?
liked it. And you also paused it perfectly when we got to the Nigun. That was a good place to stop.
Yes.
I hope that Cantor Nimi, as he talks about, on Thursday when we have all of our musical settings of the different Psalms, that he talks specifically about the settings for Psalm 29. It's so beautifully formatted with a refrain over and over again, this repetition of Kol Adonai, the voice of God. It's like perfectly planned out to be set to music. And one of our absolute favorite settings at CBST, Rabbi Kleinbaum can comment on this further, which we notate as a Sephardic setting, is actually quite an old setting that dates from a time when it was very trendy in Ashkenazi congregations, especially in Germany, to have Sephardic Oriental music in part of services. She's coming over to unmute. I'll let her.
Yeah, there was a fascination in Ashkenazic synagogues with what was happening mostly in the Dutch Sephardic world. And so in Central European, very traditional Ashkenazic synagogues, the Dutch Sephardic music sounded exotic, and it was often used as Rabbi Rapport said, you can't even say that things are used only in some, like we love settings that are different things, but it was very popular in German synagogues and Austrian synagogues especially to use music that was Dutch Sephardic, Western Sephardic. Very, very common.
And so this setting that Harold chose both, brought me to that particular piece of music, but I love that it increases our exposure to the way that these Psalms are sung all around the world, and how perfectly, as people were saying in the chat, the flamenco beat and the blend of voices that sound so uniquely Argentinian, it transcends this Psalm for me in a way that I had.
Of course, most Jews in Argentina are not Sephardic Jews. Yes. Right, that flamenco sound they've absorbed from being in Latin America, but they don't come, most of the Argentinian Jews did not come from Spain and Portugal. The Brazilian Jews came from Spain and Portugal, but a lot of Argentinian Jews were like Argentinians, Italian, Eastern European. It's not, most of the Jewish community in Argentina is not Sephardic originally, although they've absorbed, obviously, the culture of Argentina.
So running back to the text, Psalm 29 is an extraordinary, it's like perfectly in line, but it's also a little bit out of line. There is some mystery surrounding Psalm 29. So I wanted to lay out just a little bit of information before we dive deep into the text and start looking at all of the linguistic and literary fascinations that we could take with this particular Psalm. So we have been in a rubric that makes a lot of sense. It's inherently very logical. You know, you start with Psalm 95, you keep marching until Psalm 99. We've got this beautiful overarching structure that says we have one psalm that represents each of the 6 days of creation. Then we've got Lecha Dodi. Then we've got Psalm 92, which is the psalm for Shabbat. And so far, and thank you, Rabbi Kleinbaum, for pointing me to this. If you look in Richard Levy's translation of the Psalms that many of you have, starting with Psalm 95, which I think is page 360, I think 367 might be Psalm 96 by that point, but right in that vicinity. Levy's got these wonderful notes about how each of the Psalms is attributed to its day of creation and how the themes of creation in that Psalm reflect what was made on that day in the Genesis story. So he's making all of these beautiful bridges to say that we've got literary evidence that ties these Psalms to those particular days of the week, metaphorically. I also wanted to stop for 1 second to say that the days of the week do have their own Psalms. And I imagine that you'll return to this as you're studying these Psalms together. And we're definitely going to talk more about it when we talk about Psalm 92, which begins, Mizmor Shir L'Yom HaShabbat. This is a song for the day of Shabbat. There are other Psalms that have associations with weekdays. And Psalm 93 is actually the Psalm that's associated with Friday. But in our Kabbalat Shabbat rubric, it's Psalm 29. So why do we save Psalm 93 for the very end? Why don't we pick the psalm that is supposed to be associated with the 6th day of creation? And instead, we pick this psalm that's completely out of order. We jump from the 90s into the 20s. What could be so good about this psalm that would make the mystics of Svat, those of the Lorianic Kabbalistic circles, reach all the way back into the 20s to pick out a psalm? And such a psalm, this is a very, very important placement. It's the last psalm that we say in this whole rubric before we sing Lecha Dodi. This is the one that brings us right up to the edge, and then we enter into Shabbat. So this is a very, very, it's good real estate, let's say. In Psalm 29, we have all of this, you know, the things that we talk about, those 3 major themes, and we've got some minor themes that we've seen repeat over time, but naturalistic allusions, reference to God's sovereignty, you know, God's power, especially when it comes to creative power, and gratitude for all of these things. I love, in particular, we're going to get there in just a second, the note that Yehuda Berger made of this psalm in our Siddur, which if you're in our CBST Siddur, we're on page 62, and 63 is the English. I also want to point out that for, you know, in terms of our prayer choreography, which I think for many people you don't pay a lot of attention to until you're the one sitting down and everybody's standing up, or vice versa. It's not something that's often, you know, really laid out for the congregation to learn about. It's mostly like a you do it, you don't do it. Some people choose, or some people just sort of like follow the trend. This is the psalm where we all rise. And then we sit back down for Lecha Dodi. We rise for the last verse of Lecha Dodi. There aren't that many places in the Shabbat service that have direct instructions like that. They usually mirror the instructions for the rest of the week. So in my Lashon Kodesh class studying the Shabbat service, we're also going to talk about what are these places that demand certain choreography, certain postures of our bodies. So let's jump to the interlinear translation from Sefaria, Harold, for Psalm 29.
You got it, Rabbi.
And I need a Hebrew reader and then an English reader for Yehuda's translation of this psalm in the Siddur coming up right after this. So I see Sherry has volunteered. Sherry, are you volunteering for Hebrew or for English? Either's great.
For English.
For English. Great. We're gonna have a volunteer for the Hebrew. Ben, perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll start with Ben, and then Sherry will read our English translation.
You can see this?
Yep. Thank you, Harold.
מזמור לדוד, הבו לאדוני בני אלים, הבו לאדוני כבוד ועוז. הבו לאדוני כבוד שמו, השתחוו לאדוני בהדרת קודש. כל אדוני על המים, אל הכבוד הרעים, אדוני על מים רבים. כל אדוני בכוח, כל אדוני בהדר. כל אדוני שובר ארזים, וישבר אדוני את ארזי הלבנון. וירקדם כמו עגל, לבנון וסריון כמו בן רעמים. כל אדוני חוצב להבות אש, כל אדוני יכיל מדבר, יכיל אדוני מדבר קדש. כל אדוני יחולל איילות, ויחשוף יערות ובהיכלו, כולו אומר כבוד. אדוני למבול ישב, וישב אדוני מלך לעולם. אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום.
Gorgeous. Well read, and thank you. So we're going to skip over to our English translation from B'chol Levavcha. Again, on page 63 is the English, 62 is the Hebrew.
Give me a second.
Carrie's going to read the English translation, and then maybe I could ask Simon to read the note beneath the line, the sublinear, which I think is so illustrative and will teach us so much about this particular psalm.
Hold on, 63. Okay, got it. Sorry.
You're fine. I saw Anna Bachalach and I'm like, nope, we went too far.
Okay.
There you go. Sherry, you're muted. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay.
A Psalm of David. Praise the eternal, mighty ones. See in God your glory and strength. Honor the unknowable. Worship the name. Exalt the Holy One in the beauty of holiness. The voice of timelessness echoes over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Hear the magnificent one echoing over mighty waters. Yes, hear the powerful voice of the one who is. Hear the majestic voice of the revealed one. The voice of the eternal shatters mighty cedars in Lebanon, making them skip about like young calves. Yes, Lebanon and Syrian leap like young bulls. The voice of the everlasting orders lightning to split stone. The voice of infinity whirls the desert sand. The voice of power makes the wilderness quake. The voice of might twists mighty oaks. The voice of force strips forests bare. This is God's sanctuary. We all speak God's presence. The presence was enthroned at the flood. The God of all will preside over the entire universe. May the Redeemer give strength to our people. May the Holy One bless our people with peace.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Psalm 29 celebrates the presence of God in the midst of a great thunderstorm. The Hebrew word kol, which appears 7 times, here translated voice, can also mean thunderclap. The psalmist concludes with mention of a great quiet that follows the storm, recalling the mythic quiet that followed God's triumph over the forces of chaos in creation. The placing of the psalm here reminds us that our weekly struggle in the world of achievement is now at an end. We've repeated the struggles of creation, and now we too are called upon to achieve that great inner quiet that is the secret of true rest. In this psalm, the divine name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, appears 18 times. The Meturgaman, translator,
very close.
The translator-interpreter has rendered these 18 to recall divine characteristics. Yehuda Berger.
Simon. Yeah, so that word meturgaman has the Hebrew root targem, which is to translate, hidden within it. And it's the noun form, the one who does the translating. So first, Harold, if we could go to the Hebrew of the psalm, 1 page up. I just want to make sure everybody can visually see what Yehuda is referring to in terms of the repetitions of the name Adonai. So Harold, if you could float above those 18 mentions.
Here's an Adonai, here's an Adonai, here's an Adonai, here's an Adonai, here.
Exactly. And you can see that they're not random, right? This is a very carefully constructed psalm with the refrains over and over again. And specifically, most of these are associated with the phrase Kol Adonai. So Harold, if you could highlight a Kol Adonai phrase for us.
You got it, Rabbi.
Perfect. There we go. And specifically, the Kol Adonai is repeated 7 times. I mean, how perfect. So you get these 7 references to 7 days of creation. You get that, you know, unbelievably auspicious repetition of God's name, both in the phrasing of Kol Adonai and also all by itself, repeating these attributes 18 times, 18 being the gematria. Hebrew letters are also translated as numbers. Just like Roman numerals, for example. And 18 is the numerology of the word chai, which is why, you know, it's so common in Jewish culture to give gifts of $18 or to try to reach 18 multiples of something. What was the other thing that I wanted to say? You've got, we'll talk much more about these naturalistic qualities that exist in the psalm. But if you go, Harold, to the very where the asterisk is, Adonai Lamabul Yashav, that's where the psalm changes. And what Yehuda is referencing is that the beginning of the psalm is a torrent, literally, right? The voice of Adonai is like a thunderclap. So we're seeing this creative storm that references the effort that it took to create everything that is on the planet. But then at this point, everything calms. I love the way that he translated it as we are in God's sanctuary. So Harold, could we jump back down to Yehuda's translation really quick? I want to make just a couple notes and then we'll go to people's responses and reflections. So it's, you know, it's an imperfect science, the art of translation. And what I love about this translation is how Yud He Vav He is represented in all of these different names: eternal, Holy One, timelessness, everlasting, infinity, power. Like, it's gorgeous. It's incredible. What we do lose is that perfect sense of repetition. You know, the way that this is a song with a chorus of Kol Adonai. And we don't get in the English that same sense of the repetition of God's name as Adonai. You know, you get and you lose, because with the Hebrew, you don't, even though you might know that Yod He Vav He is unpronounceable and ineffable and encompassing of so many names of God, it doesn't smack you in the face the way that Yehuda's translation does. And I love that about it. But it is particularly artful in this way, which means it's not as carefully matching the format of the Hebrew as some of the other translations we've seen. I just wanted to point that out. One of the other reasons why this psalm is associated with Shabbat, we're going to look at Psalm 93, probably tomorrow when we do Psalm 92, we'll also do Psalm 93. And that has a very futured forward sense that the rabbis suggest might make more sense in terms of like the closure of the Kabbalat Shabbat Psalms rubric and hearken to a world to come. And this is a much better setting for the 7th day of creation the 6th day of creation, right before we get to Lachad Odi, and then we get the psalm particularly for Shabbat. I also want to say that this has always been a part of the Kabbalat Shabbat Psalms rubric, to what I can see, that it was common in Sfat for this to be included as part of that recitation. It's not a later like, oh no, we only had 5 Psalms before we got to Lachad Odi, we better grab another one. This was always part of the whole. It's common across the Jewish world, whether it's Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardi, of course with different surrounding material, and every individual place in all of those like huge geographic descriptors I named have different customs around it. It is not common in the Reform movement. So I don't know if anybody else in this Zoom room grew up in the Reform movement, is affiliated currently or in their past with Reform institutions, but I'll be honest and say, I wasn't in the practice of singing this psalm until I got to CBST. That in more conservative or Orthodox spaces where I prayed, I knew it was a part of the whole, and so I was familiar with it. But this is honestly the first place where I ever recited this psalm as part of Kabbalat Shabbat. I'm looking over my notes, just making sure that I got everything that I wanted to say before we jump into all of our reflections on this. What I'd love to hear from people is what you think about, especially the naturalistic themes in this psalm, and why it might make a good choice, or if you disagree, why you think it doesn't match the rest of the rubric in terms of the psalms for the days of creation and this pattern that we've established. How is it completing the pattern, or how is it disrupting the pattern in everything but the digits by which it's called, the 29 verses 95 through 99. Is there anything else you see that disrupts the pattern, or do you see this as a fitting way to complete this rubric?
Shep Wanan has his hand up.
Oh yeah, just a minor thing. I noticed some Yehuda had this alliterative thing. The mighty I can't remember my handwriting.
The voice of might twists mighty.
It's twist of might and might, and the force will strip the forest. The forest force, you know, the kind of FFMM thing. Yeah.
Yeah, great observation. So that's alliterative, right? It's using the force strips forests bare. You've got those F sounds beginning, but you also have the assonance, the sound of the vowel repeating. The force strips the forests bare. This is right. of a really talented translator.
All right. Hold on a second. Who else has a comment here? Linda Solomon has her hand up.
Yes, the first thing I noticed was the recognition of the personification, the recognition of the natural world and how God handles it, and also that God is the recognition of God as the Almighty and the one controlling all of that. So that was the first thing that struck me. And as far as not holding to the themes that we've spoken about, I felt that they were adding, there was an inclusion here in this psalm that of when God becomes the Almighty. God becomes the presence at the flood. So this is a new thought being added, a new timeline that we're following.
So I just want to make sure, Linda, in the Hebrew, it's still the same name for God. You know, it's not God.
I understand, right.
A translation on Yehuda's part. However, you know, enthroned at the flood turns into the presiding over the entire universe. That's you're absolutely right that this language of God's sovereignty is you literally see God in a throne. You see God adjudicating. That's wonderful. Also a note that Linda made about the personification. So why is it that, you know, we're talking about God's voice all the time in this psalm instead of God's mighty outstretched hand or God's incredibly deep thoughts? You know, we have lots of things that we can describe about God. Why is the voice the thing that repeats over and over again? Voice and words are an underlying theme in the creation story. You know, God says, "Let there be light." And there was. God says this is good. God says this is very good. The force of our voices in Jewish thought is magnificent and powerful. It's one of the reasons why Jews believe that words matter so much, because literally words create and words destroy in the story of creation. So of all the things to personify about God, the voice and the fact that human beings have voices that can also create and destroy is really, really significant. Who's next,
But
Terry?
I just wanted to add
Sure.
one
Oh,
other. I just wanted to add
Quick,
one more thing.
Lynn,
For me, the experience of personification of the natural world was one of my first introductions to biblical study through song. So
Lovely.
it resides in me very well.
Perfect. You're then well suited for Kabbalat Shabbat. All right, Harold, is there anybody who has not previously shared that we want to?
Ellen Poster, I don't think is shared since you've been teaching. So I'm going to recognize Ellen.
Oh, thanks, Harold. It struck me that there was some contrast between the voice of God in this psalm and the still small voice of God, where it's just the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It's not heard in the storm or the earthquake or the, yeah. And also, you said that after the thunderclap, then there was a silence. And it made me think of the parallel with the beginning of creation, when there was Tzimtzum, there was the God self-contracts.
Yeah.
So there was like a bang and then a silence. And so here, sort of at the end, the same thing. So it just
amazing. So a couple, just pulling out some of the themes that Ellen is talking about in the story of Elijah. In the book of Kings, Elijah the prophet, Elijah is standing in the crevice of a rock and asks to see God's face. And all of these things happen to Elijah, all of these crazy natural incidents that are loud and enormous. Exactly as Ellen said, the thunder booms, but God was not in the thunder, and a wind roars, but God was not in the wind. And then finally there's quiet, similar to what Ellen is describing as Tzimtzum, which means a drawing back, a Kabbalistic concept that the act of creation was not the making of new things, but actually God withdrawing a little bit to make space for new things to exist. And so you get that sense of quiet. And that's very interesting when we look at the poetry of this psalm, that God sort of draws back and sits on the throne almost. And this is when quiet and order are resume, and we can enter Shabbat into that space. Thank you, Ellen.
Yael Bat Chava in chat. Yael, if you'd unmute yourself and tell us what your enigmatic comment is about women's voices.
So I think it's just an example of how the Jewish people think a voice is so powerful. So what we have in this psalm is one example, but also the prohibition against women's voices in Orthodox environment, where it's so powerful that it could do who knows what to men, especially. So I think it's just another example of how powerful voice is.
Yeah, voices are so powerful, they are dangerous, especially when they belong to people of certain genders. And it's not, there is some sort of a question within that of, is it powerful because of a control or a lack of control? And control and lack of control on whose part, the listener or the speaker. I do want to say that women's voices, while absolutely, like in this patriarchal narrative that's been handed down to us, are barely along the margin lines, there are really extraordinary examples of women's voices in particular creating things. I'm thinking of the daughters of Slofchad, who actually spoke up and said, we can't inherit our father's portion because there are no male relatives, but then it just disappears. Like, why don't we count it all? And God says to Moses, they are right. And the power of their voices and the bravery that they had to bring their voices before everybody. That's only one example I can think of off the top of my head, but there are many others.
If I can just add, I think it dovetails with what Rabbi Kleinbaum was talking about earlier, about who has a voice and whose voice is allowed to be heard.
Yes, thank you, yeah.
Rabbi Jim Burley puts an interesting comment into chat. Don't we call the heavenly voice a bat kol, which is the feminine?
And it's so Jim is referring to a especially rabbinic concept where a voice just appears from heaven and like says the thing that either everybody or nobody's thinking. And that is uniquely gendered as feminine. It is a bat kol. It is the voice of a daughter. and it's not a ben kol, and it's not just a kol that we see in this psalm. It's got this particular designation, and sometimes there's a question about, is this God's voice? Is this an angel's voice? That's a lovely, lovely connection. Do we have anybody who's got their hand up who didn't get
Carol, let's see. Did she just put her hand? Judy Winters has not spoken recently. Judy.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, is this unusual, or does it often happen that the psalm is talking usually the psalm talks to God or talks about the person who's speaking, I. But this psalm is sort of telling people, see in God your glory and strength, exalt the holy. So who is he talking to, and is it typical?
Yeah, I love this observation about the voice of the narrator and who's the audience here, and who's the speaker. And in particular, this is, as you noticed, kind of third person, referring to God as Adonai, and not saying like, you God do this, or you humanity respond in this particular way. But even in the rubric of Kabbalat Shabbat, you get a lot of different voices in that sense. You have a lot of the collective voice, Lechu Neranana, come on, let's all praise God's name. You get a specific, you are God. Psalm 93, when we get there, is also one of those that has a particular kind of third person narration to it. So we'll have to keep an eye out for it. Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
But it's always important to keep in mind. It's a powerful tool for literary analysis.
Ben Shafran.
I want to follow up on Yael's comment about female voices, Orthodox circles. The Orthodox for millennia have forbidden women to study the Talmud or study the Torah. And yet in the last decade, it's been acceptable, even in Orthodox circles, where women have become a powerful voice in studying the Talmud and the Torah. I wonder if listening to women's voices will come next.
I wonder as well. If to your voice we would only but listen is a powerful translation of one of our previous Psalms. And in particular, Benjamin, what I love that you're lifting is that of all of the things that are considered to be acceptable or unacceptable for women to study, and the idea of women studying is itself like a radical act, the Psalms have always been within the domain of women. The recitation of Tehillim. I don't know for our New York City residents, when the subways were packed, if you ever saw Orthodox women sitting on the subway with Tehillim in their hands, reading the Psalms as, they're between place to place. It's not that the Psalms aren't an acceptable study for male readership, but in particular, they retain this characteristic of being something that is particularly close to women. So I love that we're studying the Book of Psalms.
Sarah Siegel.
You know what, I think Laurie Spear captured it best, so I'll just make one extra, where she was saying, the sovereignty is more subtle in this one. The biggest theme is nature, and attitude is like almost implicit only. But the thing that I'm craving is, I sure wish Yehuda's his split stone notion were actually literal from the psalm itself. I crave psalms that have the word stone in it, and this is not it, unfortunately. And I want to do something. I've been gathering stones. I've been gathering texts, like poems and all kinds of stuff with stones in them, because I want to use it on like a particularly prominent stone psalm. And I'm just disappointed that he did a beautiful translation, but it's not literal.
So it ain't 29, but I promise it's coming. At the very least, we'll get to Evan Ma'asu Habonim Hayta L'Rosh Pina. Cornerstone, that the stone that the builders rejected becomes the cornerstone. So you can hold out hope for that one, and maybe we'll find another one on the way.
Sherry or Simon, and then I would like to return to something that we sidelined yesterday.
Yes, how do we pick the Psalms that we're going to sing?
So Simon or Sherry? Simon is leaning forward.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the violence in this psalm. The splitting of stone, the whipping of the sand, the twisting of oaks. I remember where my parents used to live in Western Massachusetts, a tornado came quite close to their house and whipped through the forest, tearing off the tops of trees like you might tear a tissue paper. And so that kind of violence is described here. And then after they finish doing that, the force of the strips forest spared, this is God's sanctuary. You know, after all that violence, this is God's sanctuary. You know, wow, that's really quite a statement. Any comments or thoughts about that?
I'm laughing because I'm currently living really close to where that tornado tore through your parents' land. And you can see the scars in the hillside of where the tornado, there are certain trees that, you know, are in full blossom or full foliage for fall, but there are certain trees that are bare. That's the path of the tornado. Just from my own personal experience, I'm thinking a lot about birth and the incredible, you know, destructive and frankly pretty graphically violent process that goes into the creation of a brand new being. And then, you know, please God, when you're lucky, the calm that comes after it and the exhaustion and the sleep. I think that's a really, really lovely metaphor for getting through the week and entering into Shabbat. And notably, the way that Yehuda talks about that this is such a beautiful line in that sublinear note. Our weekly struggles in the world of achievement are now at an end. The world of achievement that exists during the 6 days of the week, that is put on pause for Shabbat when we enter a completely different world and a time out of time.
So let's turn, it's 10:40. If we could turn back to you, Rabbi, with that question from yesterday, if you don't mind.
Sure. And Dean, you know, I'd love you to share in the chat what you're thinking. You always have such beautiful observations. And Dean was pointing out in the chat earlier that today is the deadline for mail-in voting. So make sure you read what Dean puts in the chat. So is Rabbi Kleinbaum still here?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, hi. The other day, Harold brought up some questions, especially from Friday night's chat. You know, it was not beyond the notice of our Psalm students that on Friday night last week for Kabbalat Shabbat, the choices for the Psalms that CBST sings, because we are not a place that does literally all of the Psalms of Kabbalat Shabbat, but we exercise curatorial vision and we decide which are the ones we're going to sing for this week, what are the settings that we're going to use. And they noticed that this past Shabbat, we did 95 and 96, just like we studied in class. And perhaps this Shabbat, our Psalm choices will come from the part of the rubric that we studied together this week. How do we pick that stuff? Why do we do it? Who does it?
So first of all, there's a lot of history to that question. And of course, there's a deeper and longer answer to the question that's, you know, goes back to Saul Zalkin and Mark Bieber and the Ritual Committee. And there's some really good stories there, right, Saul? We got some about how things were done.
Yep.
And then I came to CBST in 1992. And after a few years, we disbanded the Ritual Committee. So the Ritual Committee, before I came, made all the decisions about what was done. Service leaders were then evaluated and reviewed. And it was very, how shall we say, for those of you who remember, extremely controversial, a lot of hard feelings. And so I stepped in and I became, you know, I was able to absorb the hard feelings because people were a little bit at first reluctant to completely trash me. Actually, for a while, Saul, you might remember this, I had to make a rule that nobody was allowed to give negative feedback on Shabbat because people would come off the bima and you would get just everybody who hated your drash or hated your choice or hated which psalm you chose or which music you chose. They would come up to you and tell you. So I made a rule. And of course, there was no email then either, of course, that people had to wait until Shabbat was over Saturday night to give any negative feedback. So that slowed down that because guess what? By then, Saturday night, it was so late, long later, far away. My tendency is to do all of Kabbalat Shabbat. I personally feel a loss not to do all the Psalms, and sometimes I say them quickly for myself because I really do love all of Kabbalat Shabbat. Really, what started to happen when Joyce started in 1994 and 1995, the musical settings just took a lot longer than it would take to daven through all of Kabbalat Shabbat. And we started to have to make decisions about which Psalms to do and which not to do.
Downsides of having a really talented musical director and music that is
so you have to make constant compromises. We did decide that we would always do the full Lecha Dodi, which really distinguishes us from other non-Orthodox synagogues. I'm sure you've all gone to Friday night services where, I mean, we have cantors who come to us from the Reform movement. They'll have done the first two typically the first two stanzas and the final two stanzas.
No. Verses 1, 2, 5, and 9.
Oh, there you go. And they won't even know the other verses. So that's one thing that we did to remain complete. But listen, that was controversial too. Some people hate how long Lecha Dodi can be. But we felt that that was important to maintain it in its completion and to choose 2 or 3 Psalms each week. So that's the basic rubric, 2 or 3 Psalms each week. And we typically always do the Psalm for the 6th day because that's the Psalm 29 when we stand, because that's the Psalm that leads into Lecha Dodi. You kind of do the Psalm of the end of creation to go into Shabbat. It doesn't make sense in my very small, tiny little mind that had the power to make these decisions. And then, so we always do the Psalm for the 6th day, always do the Psalm for the 7th day, always do Lecha Dodi. So then we choose 2 settings usually from day 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. I would love it if we could do all of them personally. They're very meaningful to me. As you all now know, I love Psalms. So once that's the basic rubric. We, at this point, Joyce and I have now worked together for over 25 years. Joyce, she picks the settings and she knows, we don't even have to, at this point, have a conversation of what the goal is for a given Shabbat for things like Kabbalat Shabbat. We have a couple of rules. They're not rules that we have to live by. They're just who we are at CBS. They're always women composers. So that is very unusual because there are not that many women Jewish composers in the world. So you'll look at our outline for the settings we do. They always, every single Friday night, include at least one woman composer. That is rare, folks, unless you're doing a Debbie Friedman service in the world of Jewish Shabbat services. So that's one of the principles we have. We always want to have some female composers represented in the music. And then we look at the themes of the week or the time, and sometimes there's something obvious, and sometimes it's just a nice Shabbat. And so we try not to do settings too many weeks in a row so that we have a repertoire of, as everybody knows, probably 25 settings for each thing, sometimes fewer. So we try to we try not to do the same settings in any given time. And we try to have a range of we try to have something new in every Friday night service, a setting that will be new so that people will get exposed to new things. And we really don't want people to say, oh, you can't do something new. We want there to be this energy that loves and embraces new, but we have enough old traditional CBSE so people feel comfortable. So we're constantly going for a balance. And then musically, Joyce is a genius. So she's looking at keys and how stuff segues. That's way above my pay grade. That is not necessarily about the content of the particular psalm, but rather what pieces will flow beautifully together and which would not be musically compatible.
And as all of you have experienced, there can be a certain fullness of a tone to services, or maybe it's a spiritual journey that we're going on that includes many different emotional plateaus that we want people to reach.
And I'd say one other thing, like we always want to have a woman composer, we don't want to only do happy, clappy, contemporary Jewish settings. We want to have settings that are from different Jewish traditions, from different times in Jewish history, from the 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. And then the contemporary stuff too, we want to elevate and amplify, but we don't want to only do, which is also a tendency now in non-Orthodox synagogues. So
and you know, a diversity of Jewish voices and composers around the world is particularly important to us. And somebody asked, you know, do you ever pick depending on the season?
Yes, definitely. We think about the season, we think about the time of year Jewishly, or, you know, in the American civilization or Israel, or we definitely think it all becomes part of the big pot of cooking. And by the way, we have a meeting every Wednesday from 5 to 6 o'clock. All of us, Rabbi Rapport, myself, Joyce, Sam, all of us who are regulars at leading services, we have a weekly meeting to go over how things went the Shabbat before, to discuss the coming Shabbat or the coming Shabbatot, depending. So that we call that our Vad Tefillah, our Tefillah meeting or something. Gathering.
Council on.
I am conscious of.
Sure. So the last word I want to say.
That was the short answer, by the way. That was the short answer.
Is honestly, I just want to repeat what Marcia Melnick put into the chat about the architecture of Psalm 29 as sort of our last taste before we move on to the next. That moves in the beginning from praise, the centerpiece highlighting the dramatic days of creation, and the sovereignty sits at the end, readying us for the final psalm of gratitude. So when we see each other tomorrow, we are going to study Psalm 92, which is the psalm for Shabbat. I am hoping to sneak a little 93 in there as well. As Rabbi Kleinbaum said, you know, our minhag has changed dramatically over the course of years. And at one point, 93 was a part of CBST's regular recitation.
No, Ana B'choach is a standard, is a traditional, done in a traditional, when we put the Siddur together, Ayelet and I felt strongly it should be there. It's never been a traditional part of our practice. It's very beautiful. And we had a dream that one day it would become. But if you go to an Orthodox synagogue, Ana B'choach is a standard. And there's some very beautiful settings. But we've just...
Right.
But we will not neglect 93, is all that I'm saying.
All right. So if I might, Rabbi, I'm going to play the entirety of what we played this morning, and people can listen as long as they want or get off as they want. We will see everyone tomorrow to conclude your teaching, because Thursday is Cantor Nimi. And thank you both rabbis. What an honor to have both of you here in such a fascinating conversation. We just can't thank you enough.
A total pleasure.
All right, here we go.
Amen.
See everybody tomorrow.
Has anybody been to Buenos Aires? There's the synagogues there. They're really interesting synagogues in Buenos Aires.
No.
Yeah, really wonderful. That was going to be one of my CBST trips one day, to do Jewish life in Buenos Aires. You don't have to change your time zone.
It's on my bucket list.
Sounds great.
Really, really, really interesting trip. Okay, that's one of the nets, like 5 trips down the road, but whenever we're doing trips again, huh?
Right. Whenever.
I was going in December. Well,
Buenos Aires.
I was going to do a trip around the top of Antarctica to see a solar eclipse and go to Easter Island and then come, I guess it's going east and ending up in Buenos Aires. It was going to be big and expensive and long and fast.
12-hour flight to Buenos Aires, down totally south. You stay in, I think it's the same time zone.
Yeah, this was going over starting in in Chile, and then coming, what is it going?
I didn't like the food was hard. I wasn't so into the food in Buenos Aires. So all they do is eat steak.
Oh no.
Like, and they start at 10 o'clock at night. Dinner starts at 10 at night. It's not my style, you know? Anyway, okay. Bye-bye, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Bye. Bye. We're turning you off. Oh, okay. Okay. Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Be safe. Bye.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.